Hello, everyone. Welcome back for another mini lecture. This week, we'll be focusing on language and communication in learners with autism spectrum disorder. As always, I've identified 3 learning objectives that I want you to keep in mind as you are working through the activities this week. The first objective is to be able to identify the language and communication characteristics that are associated with autism. Second, that you will identify appropriate communication learning targets that you might include as part of your students' educational programming. And finally, you will know how to teach those language and communication skills that you've identified as being appropriate learning goals and targets for your students. So let's first talk about the difference between communication and language. Oftentimes you might hear it used interchangeably, but they're actually talking about two different but related constructs. So communication is by definition social. It requires at least 2 or more people because communication involves the exchange of information. So there's always someone who's delivering the information and there's someone who needs to be receiving that information. Okay, so communication can occur face to face, like if you're having a conversation with a friend, or you could be communicating through other means, like communicating through written platforms, so blogs, newspaper articles, right? Communicating through social media, so using digital means. But communication in its essence is social in nature, that you are trying to deliver some kind of message to an audience or to another person. Language, on the other hand, is one type of mechanism that we can use to communicate. So when we think about language, we're really focused on both this verbal language, so spoken language. So those are, our words that we're using, our sentences, grammar, vocabulary. But language can also encompass nonverbal language. So we can also communicate using our gestures, right? Sign language, which doesn't rely on verbal communication, but it's a language set in and of itself, right? So communication is the exchange of information, and language is one mechanism that we use to communicate. Now, I want you to take a peek at this. I'm going to play a video. This is my daughter. She is, I think in this video, maybe just 1 year old. So I want you to think about any language that you see, right? And also think about how she communicates and what she's communicating. So I'm going to go ahead and play just a short clip. I'd like for you to have a piece of paper next to you. If you don't have one yet, go ahead and pause this video, get a piece of paper or something to jot down some notes. Remember, your goal here is to identify the communication, what she's trying to communicate, and how she's doing it. So communication versus language. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and play this. I'll just play a short clip of it. All right, let's go ahead and pause it there. All right, so that was just a short clip, but I would like for you to look at your notes. So let's think about what she was communicating, right? So in that short clip, we see a good amount of communication, right? There is some exchange between myself and her in terms of continuing to draw, right? So she's communicating that she wants me to continue the activity, right? And the way she's doing it is through a combination of some verbal approximation. So again, she is just one. So she doesn't have a lot of spoken language, but she is saying more, right? Or approximating more with verbal language. But you may have noticed she was using sign language. So this is the sign for more. And again, she's young, and so she approximates the sign. But you see that she's trying to use both verbal and nonverbal language. You'll probably also notice that she used some gestures to say yes, right? Yes, I want you to keep going, right? So she's communicating the intent that she wants me to keep doing what I'm doing. And the language that she's using is both verbal language, sign language, and nonverbal gestures, right? So that would be the conventional gesture of nodding your head for yes, right? So you can see at a very young age, children are able to communicate using a variety of means. And Penelope is typically developing, so her language skills and her nonverbal language skills are on par developmentally. For some of our kids with autism, this may be delayed, right? So, but they could still communicate, but they may use different mechanisms to try to communicate with their caregivers. All right. Oh, all right. So let's talk about the specific language and communication characteristics of students with autism. So these should look familiar to you. These are the DSM-5, right? So the clinical characteristics that are used to identify or diagnose kids with autism. The first main category is those deficits in social communication, right? Which does include, of course, communication and language characteristics. And then the second main category is restricted interests or the repetitive behaviors and mannerisms. So let's look a little bit deeper in the deficits in social communication, right? So if you recall, in the DSM-5 criteria, they identify different areas and different types of deficits within social communication that individuals with autism can demonstrate. And in order to qualify or be diagnosed with autism, you do have to show deficits in each of these areas. Okay, so the first general area is what they call deficits in social emotional reciprocity. So this could look like an abnormal social approach. So being awkward in how you initiate or approach social interactions, right? So this may, in terms of communication, this may look like how do you start a conversation, right? It can also look odd language-wise if you start communication in an awkward fashion, right? Difficulty is engaging in conversation and specifically the reciprocal back and forth conversation. So many times you may see individuals with autism who are quite skilled in responding to questions, but may not initiate questions of their own or might not initiate comments of their own, right? Or vice versa. If you're talking with an individual with autism about a specific interest of theirs, they may be quite adept at initiating the conversation, but not so adept in waiting for the other person to respond, right? Um, the reduced sharing of interest, emotions, or affect is also one of the defining characteristics of social emotional reciprocity or the lack of it, right? So again, you're talking about a specific interest of yours, but you're not able to share it in an appropriate way, or you may not be interested in sharing it at all. You kind of keep it to yourself, okay? Same with emotions. So emotions is one way to communicate a message, right? So my daughter is very good at looking at our faces and knowing when she should not be talking to us because we're focused on something or, we're having a bad day. So your emotions and affect can actually communicate a lot of information to your audience, right? A lot of times individuals with autism show a flat affect, right? So they don't show kind of the range of facial expressions, or would only show like the extreme, right? They are able to demonstrate to their caregivers when they're really upset or really happy, but the more nuanced facial expressions like worried or confused are not as apparent. Okay. Oftentimes, we may see limited initiations, right, that we talked about. So, limited communication initiations and social initiations or responses to social interactions. So, there may be times where you're trying to engage in a conversation with an individual with autism and they either don't respond or respond in a very limited fashion, will only respond with like a yes, no, right, as opposed to a full, complete response. Right, so these are just some examples of what some of the deficits in social emotional reciprocity in individuals with autism may look like. Right, that's the first general area. All right, the second area under deficits in social communication is deficits in nonverbal communicative behaviors, specifically used for social interaction. So when we are communicating with others, we naturally integrate both verbal and nonverbal communication. So, for instance, if I'm trying to get my daughter's attention and point out that a fire truck that's coming, right? Oftentimes I might use a gesture, right, which is a type of nonverbal communicative behavior, as well as my eye contact, right? Penelope, look at that, right? So I naturally communicate using and integrating different modes of communication, right? So I'm using gestures with eye contact, with words, right? And it all seamlessly gets integrated. If you're watching individuals with autism, oftentimes that integration isn't as seamless. So they may use gestures and verbal and eye contact, but it isn't as seamlessly integrated. It may look a little disjointed. So they may use it in isolation, but not together. Another abnormality that is quite common in a lot of individuals with autism is not making appropriate eye contact, right? Or having awkward body language. So expressing their behavioral mannerisms in a really exaggerated way. Right? So again, another way we communicate is through our nonverbal eye contact and our use of our body. Right? And oftentimes with individuals with autism, that looks qualitatively and quantitatively different than what we would expect in typical development. Okay? We also see that a lot of individuals with autism may have difficulty understanding, that should say understanding, not understating, deficits in understanding and using gestures. So again, we oftentimes see limited gestures or just one type of gesture, right? They may use more conventional gestures like nodding or shaking their head, but not so much like informative gestures. So, when we're talking naturally, if I'm talking about, especially the young kids, and I'm saying like, I saw a really big whale, right? I might separate my hands like this to emphasize size. So we just naturally use a variety of gestures, but in individuals with autism, it's much more limited. Okay. And again, our lack of facial expression and nonverbal communication. So expressing our feelings nonverbally through our face is oftentimes limited in individuals with autism. Okay. So I talked about two main areas as they relate to language and communication for autism. Now, this is another video of me and my daughter. So this is just a simple book reading. She's about to go take her nap. In this video, she's about a little over 2 years old. So you'll see that her spoken language has developed quite a bit since the first video. But what I want you to look for are some of the characteristics that are lacking in a lot of individuals with autism. So tying it back to those diagnostic criteria. So just in this simple book reading, I want you to look for her ability to engage in a back and forth conversation with me. Right? Do you see any evidence that she is sharing? How does she share her interests? Right? How does she share emotions or affect? Right? Do we see a range of emotions and affect from her? Right? Is she able to initiate social interactions as well as respond to social interactions from me? Right? And I want you to look closely at how she is able to integrate both verbal, so the time she is talking, as well as any nonverbal communication. So look to see how she uses them seamlessly together. So when she's talking to me, does she make eye contact? Does she talk and use gestures at the same time? Okay. Look at the quality and quantity of her eye contact, her gesture use, as well as her facial expression. So again, these are all different types of communication that children engage in. Some of it is verbal language, some of it is nonverbal language. Okay. But I want you just to keep a running list of these different types of things that you see. And again, Penelope is typically developing, right? So this is an example of what we might expect out of a typical 2-year-old. All right, I'm going to go ahead and play that for you. All right. So I hope that you made note of lots of communicative acts going on there, right? Lots of both verbal language as well as nonverbal language in terms of her use of gestures, right? Even though we're reading a book, like she does stop, especially when she is initiating or we're engaging conversation, she makes appropriate eye contact with me. Right. She is seamlessly using gestures, right? She was talking about the leg going around, round, round. So she is using a gesture in combination with her spoken language, right? And you'll see that she makes a range of facial expressions. Again, that was just maybe 3 or 4 pages of a book, but you see when she scrunches up her face, right? And she'll smile, like when she's making the joke about how she likes dog food, right? So we're already seeing a lot of subtle facial expressions from her. So she's communicating affect through her face as well as through her voice. Right? All right. So the next area under social communication deficits that are characteristic of individuals with autism is being able to develop, maintain, and understand relationships. Right. So this is very much more social in nature, but again, kids who have difficulties with communication, those communication difficulties may impact their ability to develop relationships. Right. So I'm thinking particularly in terms of difficulties in sharing imaginative play. So I want you to think about how young kids play and play make believe. Oftentimes they're using language to describe what they're doing, right? They're using gestures, they're using a facial expression if they're, playing with superheroes who are in a match, right? Or they're in a fight. Yep. So they're using language, both verbal and nonverbal, to communicate something. Okay. Difficulties with language and communication can hinder your ability to make friends, right? So being able to share your interests, to talk with your friends. If you're unable to do that, then that can hinder the ability of you to make friends, right? And also the absence of interest in your peers, right? If you're not really that interested in peers, then you're not going to go out and initiate social interactions, right? Or for some individuals with autism, they actually are quite interested in their peers, but they don't know how to initiate those interactions or how to communicate effectively to introduce themselves into a social situation. So you can see how having a deficit in language or communication can impact broader social development. All right. So let's talk about how we figure out what might be appropriate communication targets that we might want to think about when we're planning our educational programming for students with autism. So when we're thinking about our IEPs and what might be appropriate social and communication targets for a given student. So if we're thinking about communication, we need to be mindful that communication takes a number of different forms. For many of our students with autism, they do develop speech or spoken language. For some individuals, that will be delayed. And so oftentimes you may be working with your speech language pathologist to implement and teach a augmentative and alternative communication system, or AAC. So that could be a low-tech AAC, like a picture exchange communication system or a picture communication board, or it might be a high-tech system, so like a voice output device. So you have to think about what form your students would use to communicate, right? We have to think about content. So maybe some of your objectives will work on expanding their vocabulary so that they have something to communicate with, right? Maybe for some students, they actually do have a well-developed vocabulary, but aren't very adept at talking about a range of topics. So kind of getting them outside of their own perseverative interests and expanding topics, right? So I oftentimes think about when I was teaching preschool, we would use snack time and lunchtime as an opportunity to work on some of our communication goals. And for many of my students, the communication was to talk about an unpreferred topic with their peers, right? So we would use that opportunity to take data on the extent to which they would respond to peers' questions about an unpreferred topic, right? If they were able to initiate questions, appropriate questions during snack time. So we called it snack talk, right? So we used it as an opportunity to teach children to talk about a range of topics and respond to questions on a range of topics, as well as to take data on the extent to which they were doing it. Okay. We also need to think about expanding the function of communication. So many of our students may be quite good at requesting, right? If you think about even developmentally with typical kids, when they first start talking, it's usually to request something to meet their needs, right? They're saying like, I want a cookie, I want a hug, I want up, right? So oftentimes requesting, many kids will learn how to request very easily because it serves their own interest, right? If they use that language, they're reinforced by that because they get what they're asking for. But we also want to make sure that our students can use communication for other purposes, so beyond requesting. So are they able to tell us when they don't like something? So can they protest and use communication appropriately to protest, right? Melting down, laying on the floor is a form of communication. They're communicating to us they don't like something, but we want them to be able to appropriately protest, right? So teaching them to ask for a break, teaching them to say, no, I don't like that, right? And of course, especially for kids with autism, we also want them to use communication for social purposes. So to socially share information appropriately and to engage in social conversations appropriately, okay? So these are the three components we really need to think about in terms of communication when we're developing our goals for our students. I want to make a quick note about the difference between both expressive language and receptive language. So we separate out expressive production. That might be speech. It might be, expressively like pointing to a picture to show what they want, right? They may express communication by moving toward an object, right? For a lot of kids with autism, they may, who have limited verbal language, they may grab your hand and walk you towards something, right? Or use your hand like an object, right? And show you what they want you to do, right? Expressive production also includes asking questions, making comments, right? So how are they initiating or expressing their communication to you, right? We also, another part of communication is the receptive portion of communication. So receptively and comprehending the language and communication around them, right? So if I'm a teacher and I ask them, all right, today your choices for free time are coloring or blocks, right? Are they able to understand my language to communicate a choice? Okay. Do they understand language well enough to follow directions? Okay. So that would be like, it is time for recess. I would like everyone to line up by the door. Do they have the receptive comprehension to do that? Okay. Responding to a question also involves being able to comprehend language, right? I'm asking you a question. You need to understand what I'm saying in order to form an appropriate response. Okay, so some of your goals may be focused on the expressive part of communication. Others might be focused more on the receptive part of comprehension. Again, it's all individualized. It depends on your learner's needs, right? But be aware that communication and language involves both an expressive as well as a receptive component, right? And also, I want to warn folks that it is oftentimes a misconception that kids who have strong expressive language, so kids who are able to talk fluently in full sentences, oftentimes adults may assume that because they can use expressive language quite fluently, that they have strong receptive language, right? They're talking, so therefore they must be able to understand language in their environment. So we can't assume that, because oftentimes we do see what we call an uneven profile, where sometimes some kids have really strong expressive language skills, but really weak receptive comprehension skills. So as an educator, that tells us we need to focus a lot more on teaching those receptive comprehension skills for those students, right? And vice versa. We have a lot of people who underestimate kids who have limited verbal expression, right? And they assume that because they aren't talking, right, that they also are not understanding their environment. And we know that's not the case, right? We have many kids who have limited verbal ability, right, who are quite adept at understanding what's going on around them and following those directions, right, and making choices and responding to a question, but not using verbal language. We'd have to give them some kind of alternative and augmentative communication system, right, to both express their language as well as a mechanism to respond to other people who are asking them questions, right, or engaging them in conversation. So again, do not assume that strong expressive skills equals strong receptive skills or vice versa. Okay, we need to make sure that we're looking broadly and tailoring our instruction to meet our students' needs. All right. Now, this is a nice little overview about how communication develops over time. Okay, and this is based on what we know about typically developing communication skills. But it's important to understand typical development so that we as educators, as special educators, have a sense of where we might need to intervene, okay, or when intervention might be necessary. Okay, so starting as young as 8 months to about 18 months. So this was the first video that you saw of my daughter. She would fall in this range. You would see pre-linguistic communication. So she doesn't have fully developed spoken language, but she definitely has intentional nonverbal communication, right? She was nodding her head. She was clearly communicating that she wanted me to go on if she didn't even though she didn't have the spoken language to fully articulate that, all right? Following the pre-linguistic communication stage is the early emerging language. So this would be the second video that you saw of my daughter reading a book with me. So here we oftentimes see kids using clear single words and being able to combine those words to create multi-word utterances, right? So this is typically around 12 through 36 months. So that is a big range. So a big range where kids are starting to develop their language use. So you saw my daughter who was about 24 months. So she was well into the combination word phase and speaking in full sentences. So again, there's a lot of variability and a lot of growth, excuse me, at this young age. We also then after that stage, advance to our basic advanced language. So, again, using multi word utterances to full sentences for a variety of purposes. And in typically developing kids, this is oftentimes the stage that preschoolers are in. So they're using it for, requesting as well as, engaging in social interactions to protest, right? So they're using it for a number of purposes. Whereas at early stages, they may be using their single words primarily for the purpose of requesting. Like my daughter in the pre-linguistic communication stage was really using it for the function of requesting more, right? She wasn't using it to really share a conversation with me, right? It was really to serve her own purposes. Right. Now, depending on where your students are, the different stages, your intervention targets may look different. Okay. So for students who are in the pre-linguistic stage, regardless of what age, right? So now we're talking about kids with special needs who may be delayed in terms of their development. So even though the pre-linguistic stage is usually between 8 to 18 months in typical development, we may have some 3-year-olds who are in this pre-linguistic stage. So for those students who are in the pre-linguistic stage, some intervention targets might be teaching students to use gestures to share intentions, right? Teaching them appropriate and effective strategies to protest, right? Exert social control, so tell people to stop or do this, right? And to regulate their emotions, right? To say, I'm sad, I need help, right? Now, they're pre-linguistic here, so they would not be using words, but how can we think about students who don't have spoken language? We need to give them another mechanism to communicate these expressions, right? Um, it may also be appropriate to develop a learning target where they're combining both vocalizations and gestures. So again, remember one of our defining characteristics of autism is that they don't integrate gestures and vocalizations seamlessly. So that might be something that we're working on with them, right? Observing and imitating functional use of objects. So that doesn't naturally at first, at face value, seem like a communication goal. But if you think about how kids learn language and learn how to communicate at young ages, they're watching other people, right? They're watching models of it. So this is one way that we can start to develop kind of those foundational skills that will allow them to better learn language. We're going to teach them how to observe and imitate using concrete objects at first, right? But then eventually generalizing being able to imitate using objects to being able to imitate other things like imitate our language, okay? At young ages, books are a really great way to teach language, right? So you can embed opportunities for them to imitate how you use the book. So imitate turning pages, right? Pointing to pictures of books and labeling it, right? So they have an opportunity to imitate and learn vocabulary, right? So these are all appropriate targets for our students who are in that pre-linguistic communication phase. Right. For students who are in the emerging communication phase, we're going to be working on expanding their words, right, and how they use words. Okay, so going on beyond just labeling items to maybe including some verbs, right? Connecting words like between, under, right? We're going to maybe have some goals about using combinations of words. So moving beyond just one word responses. Can we expand their utterances gradually? Okay. Teaching initial grammar, right? So I want cracker instead of me want cracker. We're also going to be working on representational play. So that's that imaginative play, like using objects to represent other things and using the language to engage in those kind of play behaviors. Because again, play, being able to engage in play is one way that young children learn. And kids who are not engaging in play have limited opportunities to learn. Right, so we want to make sure that we are giving our students every opportunity to take advantage of their learning context. Okay. We're also going to we can start developing their understanding about comprehending language through story sequences. So first Goldilocks does this, then she eats the porridge, then she chooses a bed, right? We could start embedding language within teaching language and rhyming sounds, right? Or naming letters. So making it developmentally appropriate, but thinking intentionally about what communication and language can be embedded within our natural activities that we do every day, right? And then also working on a variety of speech sounds. So, as special educators, we oftentimes are not working on the specific speech sounds. That's something that oftentimes a speech language pathologist would be working on. But with our students, they oftentimes only get, 30 to 60 minutes a week with their speech language pathologist, depending on what's written in on their IEP. So, as educators who are seeing our students every day, we're oftentimes working really closely with our SLPs so that we know what they're working on so that we can continue to work on it throughout the week, right? So even though it's technically within the realm of an SLP's job, we are going to be supporting those language goals, right, in our classroom because we're the ones who are going to see our students every day. Right, let's talk about advanced communication target. These may be actually enacting social sequences, right? So do they comprehend language well enough to pull together a story and act it out for me? Okay. Are they understanding nonverbal gestures, right? And expressions and gaze, right? For a lot of our students with autism, expressions are hard, especially those non-literal meanings, right? So saying my eyes are bigger than my stomach doesn't literally mean my eyes are bigger than my stomach, right? A lot of individuals with autism take language very literally, right? So what is the extent to which they understand the non-literal meaning of a lot of idioms or phrases we may be using in common language? Okay. Are they able to understand and use intonation? Right. A lot of times you may notice that our individuals with autism naturally have kind of a flat tone, so not a lot of modulation. Right? So one goal might be to use more modulation, right? Or express their emotional states more effectively. So it's not just a completely flat affect all the time, right? Can students with autism start providing background information about themselves? So a lot of times if you think about, walking into a social situation where you're new and you're unfamiliar, a lot of times the first thing you do is you introduce yourself and say a little about yourself, right? So can we give them the language to engage in some appropriate social initiations? Okay. Are students with autism able to show how sentences in a conversation relate, right? So another characteristic you might see is that individuals with autism may kind of jump nonsensically to different topics, right? So one skill we might work on is how to build naturally within a conversation, right? How you stay on topic and respond on topic, okay? And then another final goal may be helping individuals problem solve. So, are they actually able to comprehend the social situation and problem solve effectively? Are they able to monitor their own behaviors and their own communications effectively? All right. So that is a lot of stuff that we need to be thinking about as educators. But fortunately, we do have some tools that will help us identify and prioritize what learning goals and objectives we should be targeting for a given student. So this is just one example of what we call a curriculum linked assessment. This is the AEPS. This is something that I used when I was a preschool teacher. This is geared for young children. If you work with older children, there are other curriculum linked assessments that your district may be using. But essentially, this is a curriculum linked assessment in that you complete it based on an individual student, and it identifies where their strengths are as well as their weaknesses are. And the weaknesses will guide you in terms of what you need to be working on. Right. So we can play around with this a little bit in our class meeting, but just rest assured there are tools to help us identify and prioritize what objectives we should be working on with our students. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap up this mini lecture. Just as a reminder, you do have some tasks remaining for this week's module. So again, you have your required readings. You have a chapter in your textbook. It's going to be chapter 6. This will be what you focus your discussion role on. And you also have an article from Bondi and Frost, who are the developers of the Picture Exchange communication system. And that article is located on our Canvas site. I do have another 8-minute video that I'd like for you to watch in addition to this mini lecture. This video is on tips for communication. Again, it's pretty brief, it's about 8 minutes, but I think it should be helpful in reinforcing some of the things that you've read about in the chapter. When you are done with the readings and watching the videos, make sure to do the knowledge check and submit your discussion rule. And make sure those are all done before our next class meeting on Thursday. All right, folks, I will see you then. Bye.